We
Thank
are
you.
now. Thank you for reminding me.
Yep, no problem.
I'll
Sorry
start
about
over.
that.
All right, so remember last time we were taking a look at systems of assessment, and one of the first things we had you all do was take a look at the Michigan assessment, state assessment model, and we did a notice and wonder. And so I wanted to kind of recap what we were kind of able to figure out last time. One of the questions that came up from our notice and wonder was, do all states have the same system? And we figured out, no, they don't. We also answered the question, how do different districts assess? We heard a lot of variety from our participants, from district summative to formative, just using like map testing and things like that. A couple of questions that we didn't get answered, however, were how does assessment support student learning, and how are teachers learning through assessment? And another question that came up last week too is, we noticed there were some gaps. So that's what we're going to hopefully address for you all today.
So one of the things that we did last time was we did this activity where we looked at what a body of evidence for assessment learning is. And we had this triangle of written evidence, observational evidence, conversational evidence, kind of creates an assessment of learning in the formative side, and there's also those summatives to the side. We looked at this data and we were kind of curious about some of this and what you guys think about some of these terms, because we just were kind of curious about where the dots were placed and the patterns that we saw there. And so starting early on with written evidence, that's pretty obvious. Kids write something down and we then evaluate that. So that'd be a worksheet, a lab, something like that, that we can grade when we leave the classroom. Observational evidence, I guess this is where we need to figure out, what does observational and conversational evidence really mean to you guys? So Anya's going to activate the Pear Deck here to have you guys type in your responses. What does observational evidence mean? What does conversational evidence mean to you?
So yeah, watching students do something like draw a model, one of the practices. All right, observational, what you see, hear, feel. Conversational, talking about what you see, hear, and feel and how that applies to the lesson. The teacher talks with the student to probe his or her understanding. And observational, what do you see the students do interacting with manipulatives, perhaps listening in on peer discussions. Observational, teacher elicits evidence without verbal interacting with students. Conversational, good. Teacher elicits evidence through the use of questioning. What you see, what you hear. Conversational evidence can be assessed as I am walking throughout the room, listening to student conversations for evidence, like they're able to talk about structure and function.
And this is kind of what we noticed when we looked at our original diagram, that triangle diagram that we have, that we definitely see this idea of what am I looking at from students versus what am I talking to them about. But there's so much more with that conversational evidence that I think that we can get to, or even the observational evidence for that. And so I wanted to dive into this conversational evidence specifically a little bit, because I think that's very rich. What kind of conversations are you having with students during this time? Is it just simply listening to them as you walk by? Is the evidence that you're getting when you sit there and talk to them? And Anya's already gone ahead here to this slide, which is about the formal versus informal evidence that we can get during formative assessment practices. And I think this is definitely part of it, that we can have these formal evidence of formative assessment, and then also this informal evidence down here on the bottom. And in the formal, this looks more like stuff you've planned ahead of time. If you look under that first, together information from students at a planned time. Examples are quizzes or embedded assignments. A teacher takes time to analyze the information to collected from students. So taking what you've gotten and taking it home. That looks a lot more like the written evidence. But the informal, I think, is probably just as important, especially when we look at assessment practices on how to improve student learning. And the the informal evidence there is more on the fly. If you guys can see that in the second box there, which says recognizing. Teacher reacts on the fly by recognizing student responses and comparing them to accepted ideas. And I think this is kind of the big difference here, is that when you look at the responses that came up just a minute ago from you guys on the last slide, it's what I hear from students, but we didn't really break down what that looks like. What does it mean, what I've heard from students? Does that mean when I stood in the front of the classroom and said, hey, what is a DNA molecule? Or is it more when I'm sitting next to the students? Or is it walking by and just listening to conversations as I roam around the room? And so I think that's where we're going to spend a lot of our time today, talking about the differences in formal versus informal formative assessments. Anya?
Okay, yeah. So we, last time this body of evidence in the classroom was where we knew that we could fill some of those holes and some of those gaps in that big assessment system. And so we talked about collecting this body of evidence and what that evidence would look like. And so we gave you guys a little bit of homework of the STEM teaching tool, where we really were kind of trying to push our thinking. So that formal formative assessment practice that Scott was just mentioning, this one feels more common to me. This feels more natural, where if you look at my graphic up here, we have a teacher, calling on one of the student responding to the teacher, and this can really feel like that conversational evidence that maybe we were saying that we do quite a bit in our classroom. And this really reminds us of that IRE model, that initiate, response, evaluate. It's real similar to that formal formative assessment of the, giving a worksheet or collecting a quiz or something like that. But the STEM teaching tool really forces us to challenge those ideas and look at things from a different perspective, and pushes our thinking in this informal formative assessment practice. And so I'm going to go ahead and just click on this. If you didn't have an opportunity to look through this last time. So this is the talk resource tool that where we really are planning prior to our classroom talk, different pieces of informal data that we can take and verify and use as evidence that the students actually have the standard, or they have met the learning goal or the learning target for that day. One of the PDFs that's linked in here is a seating chart, which I think is such a awesome way to do it. Have your clipboard out, have your seating chart on it, and as you're walking around, observing, getting some of that observational evidence, which we all said we wanted to work on based on the data of our triangle from the time before. And what would we be looking for? How would we plan for that? And so this gave us some really good ideas of how maybe we would think about our SPED students and our EL students, and how we could track this evidence as we're walking around observing, and then what this actually looks like during the classroom, and how, like Scott said, with the on-the-fly pieces, how are we going to maybe ask that next question or probe that thinking a little further to really see if they are making that sense-making visual, like can we visualize their thinking? And maybe not just giving us that one right answer, but are they having those conversations with each other that maybe allows us to say, I think this student does get it, and being able to check that off. So, and then after that classroom talk is over, how can we change what we're doing for the next day, and not waiting for that worksheet or that quiz, but that daily evaluation that maybe is a little bit more informal than formal. And so what are some of the things that, while looking at that STEM tool, maybe even if you clicked over to the STEM teaching tool number 16, if you headed over to that, what are some things that you saw that you might think that would be good to take away from this article, or how did it push your thinking when you were thinking about that conversational evidence, and instead of having it just that back and forth, really thinking about it to that next level, and maybe starting to put some of those pieces of evidence overlapping them a little bit. So I'm just going to give you a quick second to give us some feedback on that STEM teaching tool and how it pushed our thinking. So I'll give you guys just 1 minute to just maybe put something quick. Mm-hmm. So Jody, do you want to read some of these responses, and then it'll kind of take us into your slide that's next here.
Sorry, I'm working off 2 screens. It looks like it's important to plan ahead for this type of assessment. I wholeheartedly agree with that one. And because as we've been going through this process, that's the one thing that I figured out is the preparation. I don't think the preparation will be as lengthy as it seems right now, just because it's new. So of course it takes us much longer to figure things out. But as we continue to practice these skills, just like in anything in our lives, the more you practice, the better you get, the quicker you get to accomplishing that. So the other one, wondering how the addition of, whoa, stop moving it on you. Wondering how the addition of student characteristics might influence the collection of evidence. How would I use that information? Knowing a student is English language, special ed. Any of you guys have any good ideas on that one? Because I struggle with that as well.
So
yeah, that was, I mean, that was my thought as I was going through there. So there's a place that you can click and it takes you to another tool that actually has a little bit more information on it.
Okay.
The PDF up there that's listed at the top. And then it has a student idea progression chart. And one of the things on that chart is to jot down some information about students. And I'm just wondering how, if I make note that a student is an EL or special ed, or like they give an example of tech savvy or something like that, how that would change the experience of collecting that information.
And which link were you talking about, Eric, here?
Yeah, so if you go right up next to the purple bar up there, it says PDF formative assessment tool. Nope, below that. There you go.
This one.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. With this top chart.
Yeah, I think that the idea for this would be, it gives the teacher, who you should know your students anyway and their strengths and weaknesses, but maybe as you're getting started, it's nice to have that extra little reminder that this student needs, this IEP service, or this student struggled in the last unit to understand the concept, so that when you go to their table and talk to them, you might, plan a little bit extra time to work with them on that particular issue. It's the only way I can see it specifically.
So I actually used a system similar to this my last year in the classroom, and except for I used it on note cards, and then I had them highlighted different, so I knew which students were EL and which students were my SPED students or whatever. And when I was walking around and verifying, so I had an instance once where one of my SPED students was bilingual and had asked a question for an EL student, because the EL student asked him in Spanish. The SPED student then asked my regular ed student the question, then came back to my SPED student, and he translated it for the EL student, which is exactly that type of, conversations that you want to be having, because that EL student would have never been able to ask me that question. And so just having the knowledge of which students were what, especially at the beginning, like Scott said, it was really useful for me just to, like if I helped that SPED student a little bit while they were gathering information or something, and then I was able to maybe have them share out just to, build their confidence. I think there's lots of different ways that you can use a chart that has some of these little identifiers on them when you're in your classroom and you're facilitating discussion, especially if you have 6 classes a day, and sometimes all those little things you don't get until the middle of 2nd semester. But with this, you can have them right off the bat at your fingertips all the time.
Yeah, Eric, like I work in a rural school, so like I've known these kids since they were in kindergarten. For the most part, I don't know if I would need that tool, because these kids have grown up literally from kindergarten to, 6th grade before I have them. By then, I have a pretty good understanding of who they are. Some better than others. They still don't understand if they're in 1st grade and I know their name. That's probably not a good thing. But anyways, we'll continue on. But that's a really good example too, especially I think using that key at the beginning of the year. And especially, if you have a new student that's come in, that you're, even you can look at some past reports, so you have a better idea as to their strengths, their weaknesses. I could almost use that as a strength weakness type key too, so that it could just help me know what some of the kids' strengths are, weaknesses are. So, but we're gonna move on to going.
Top one here, Jody.
What?
I think you missed this top one here.
The kids talk about what their perspective was and explain why they thought that. Misconceptions could also be addressed.
Big one. That one's really good.
So we're gonna go to Anya, thanks. We're gonna go back to this body of evidence, because we kept. I think I always thought of this as kind of a model, but I think there's something missing from it, in my opinion. And I think the biggest thing is arrows. So we're going to take some time and draw some arrows to make some connections between this. this diagram to see if we can make it into a model in Pear Deck. And he's gonna show it to us. Oh.
We might ask you to share out about some of these arrow connections, so be ready for some share out of examples, perhaps.
That doesn't mean stop drawing.
Can everybody draw, or is there just maybe one arrow? I'm not sure. Maybe we should start the share out.
Yeah, because mine doesn't show up on here.
Who was able to draw? Was everybody? Nicole, could you draw?
Yes, I could.
Okay, good.
Nicole, do you mind sharing? Like, what did you?
Well, I think mine is the one that's on the screen right now. So
Okay.
I looked at, it's not very good drawing, but I looked at how you could take the observational evidence, what the kids see here, kind of what they collect, and then they could have them write it, write down their evidence, and then maybe explain why, you know, what they saw or how they saw it or how they could hear what any way that just, I mean, you could add any type of written element to it that you wanted with the evidence, and then have the kids talk about it. Why did you think that? Why did that happen? So you can kind of really expand on that too, and then you can move that to the assessment. That's kind of what I was thinking.
Great.
Yeah, Nicole, I have the, that's kind of what I was trying to draw as well. And I have some really unique students, because I have one student who she does not speak, she cannot use her hands, she has no, but she uses what's called a Dynavox. So she uses her eyes. So it's very difficult for me to get, like, she's super smart. Her brain functions just fine. She just can't communicate like
Right.
everybody else. And so I know, like, one of my examples for body of evidence for her understanding is sometimes I use other kids' models,
Mm-hmm.
and I take their names off of them and everything, but then I give her, like, I number them 1, 2, 3, and 4, and she gets to pick which model she thinks would best represent
What she's thinking.
what. Yeah.
Yeah.
So sometimes you have to be super creative, you know, especially in that case, or like Anya's case of students that, you know, don't speak the language and figuring that stuff out. So I think my biggest thing as I was going through this entire process was trying to figure out how to, like, organize it so that I can make sure that I have student, like, I remember student B said this at one point, but I don't remember maybe the date or whatever. And you always want to make sure, I mean, we talk about to students all the time about making sure that they have evidence to support their reasoning. So I think it was huge.
I mean, you might have kids too that are very difficult for them to have written expression. So they might be able to make the observations and be able to talk about it really easily, but not write about it. So, you know, that kind of gives them some type of strength there if they have a weakness, or vice versa. They may be able to make the observations, and they may be able to write about it, but then they don't have that verbal expression or don't know how to express it in a conversation. So I think that's a good mix of trying to get all of your skills and then also improving those skills.
Who had this one with the circle I think a couple of you had a circle, the purple and the black, but one of you want to talk about this?
Yeah, that was mine, and this is Nicholas. And just like I think it was Nicole was mentioning before earlier, when she had her kind of cyclic icon or model going on there, they really all just kind of do feed into each other. And then at the same time too, at least for me, I just drew the arrows going back in. And I saw some of the other models that were shared out, like arrows coming back out from the center area that we use to kind of get information about where students are in their learning, and they at the same time to get information as well where they are. So that's why I've got the arrows kind of pointing in, but I'd also put them out too.
Great. Great. Betsy, did you have, which model was yours?
That one that you've got up there right now, or no?
Okay.
No, what I'm looking at my own. Sorry, it's the second one from the left.
Okay, this guy right here.
That one. Oh, second one. Nope. Go up. There you go.
Okay,
Yeah.
tell us about what your thinking was here.
Yeah, so first of all, know that I suffer from seeing like connections between everything. So that's why I've got arrows all over this. But I guess what I really started thinking about here is, number one, how all of these, like my arrows pointing toward the center, all of these can be evidence. They can all serve as assessment of learning. And then like everybody, or what other people are saying is, we can observe conversations, we can observe written evidence. But then I started thinking a little bit too, if kids are making observations, we can have them write about it, or we can have them talk with each other about it. And what I love about this is this really starts to get us to think about multimodal assessment, which is so important in terms of equity. So.
Great. Tracy, did you want to share yours out?
Mine was the purple one, just that whenever kids are doing anything in the classroom as a teacher, you are always listening and observing, collecting some sort of formative assessment to guide your instruction from that point on. So
that's great. And I think when I was in the classroom last, it was like, we would make those little, like, oh, I've seen them do this, so maybe I could bump up this grade. And I know I talked about this last time, but not until I was actually recording it. And I did get to the point where I did have a seating chart where I was able to do, like the little verify, oh yeah, I heard them talking about that. I observed them doing that practice, and really collecting, trying to fill in those gaps that we were talking about earlier. So these are much better models than our representation that we had from last time. So this takes us to this, the informal piece, the formative assessment that is in that STEM Teaching Tool 16. So right in the first paragraph of the homework, it said, click on slide 16. And it really talks about the difference between, that IRE model and the teacher asking a student giving back this information, and then I'm going to, change my lesson, or does she or he have it, yes or no, versus this, I kind of, put something out there, the student responds, the teacher recognizes the student respond, and then I use that response to then give something else. And that idea of, we're questioning and we're trying to really bring out that student's thinking. And I just really love how this tool brings that back around and starts us thinking about that we can actually track that. And that can be evidence for it. It doesn't have to be a worksheet. It doesn't have to be a quiz. It can be a conversation, and it can be a conversation between students to really fill those gaps that maybe a worksheet or a quiz or a state test leaves, that we can gather And that's why that piece is the biggest in Michigan's model. That classroom piece is the biggest, is because we can make those in the moment responses. So just a couple of questions here, thinking about this model and informative assessment. How can this be helpful for you actually collecting evidence in your classroom? And how could this be helpful for students? And how could this even be helpful for your conversations with your admin, or about how your students are doing in their classroom with these new 3-dimensional standards? So I'll just give you a second here. So how's this just help you, help the teacher learning, help student learning, and everybody that's really involved with this shift?
Can I ask a question before we do that, if it's not too late? Can you clarify for me what the step in between the teacher uses the student response and the teacher elicits would look like? What's happening on that arrow?
So after the student observes the student response, and then now I'm gonna use that response to then bring up another question.
Okay, is that what it is then?
Well, let's
yeah, so in the IRE model, it's more about, I'm asking what's 2 + 2, you said 4, I said good, end of discussion. The ESRU model allows more for conversation to develop. Hey, what kind of model can you make for this? The student responds, I can kind of give some feedback and use that as a springboard for another question to bring more conversation with students.
I can add to that also. I think what this really reminds me of are those talk moves that are really important in the classroom. And when we ask, we're listening in on a conversation, and maybe a student isn't giving complete evidence, and so you might say something like, "Ooh, tell me more about that," or what data supported this this comment, this claim that you're making. Or maybe we even ask another student to restate what one student has said. So I think that those are things that fit on that arrow also.
Yeah, Eric, I used those talk moves. I actually just laminated them, put them randomly placed on kids' desks. And I noticed that students started using it too. Like if student A was explaining something, student B, who didn't understand it, was able to, because they almost had those talk moves, or they were able to have more of a conversation, because then he or she would be like, okay, this is what I'm hearing. Am I right or am I wrong? Like, is this what you're trying to say? And it was more of a conversation rather than, rote memorization, or me ask a question, especially so often when we ask a question, a lot of students will just give us, 1 or 2 word response. And now all of a sudden they may give me those 1 or 2 words, but then somebody in the class will say, but can you explain? And then, so I think that's kind of what this whole entire thing is trying to say.
Yeah, which makes sense. It sort of begs another question, which is maybe just kind of rhetorical, but at what point do you know when you're done in that cycle? You don't have to answer, it's okay.
Okay, good.
Part of that, Eric, will be, what is the endpoint you want to reach? Are you looking for a set definitive answer, or are you just looking for that discussion point to start the next activity?
Right, and I think those evidence of learning statements, I used a lot to write my learning targets. And I think just diving into that framework and really knowing what the intent of the standard is, and just trying to get them to that level by using those documents that were provided, that's what helped me absolutely the most. The further that I dug into the standards, feel like the further I was able to push students' thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I feel like, I mean, there's so much that could go into the whole thing, right? I mean, the student response, you know, we sort of think of it as a back and forth, and we move through this cycle, and when we get to where we think we want to be, then we're done. You know, adding a component in here of, you know, you really want one of the outcomes of that conversation to be the student coming up with additional questions that they might have about whatever the topic is, right? And so instead of just it being what's the student giving the teacher, you know, kind of in the moment, what is it that's coming out of this conversation that's prompting the student to go another direction and start to do some question development and some problem solving on their own. Yeah, as opposed to I've seen this you know, the teaching tool before. That's always my question with this is, you know, it's just, there's so much more that you could put into it that it seems like such a cut and dry kind of process. But there's a lot more there to be talked about, I think.
Well, and Eric, I guess I just kind of had this idea too. When you think about this, it's teacher student. When you think of teacher, you think I'm the teacher, that's the student. But when we think about three-dimensional learning, I'm not a teacher strictly, I'm a student as well. And every kid that's in that room is a teacher / a student. So I don't know what you would put instead of teacher or student, or if it's just a matter of us training our brains differently to understand that when it says teacher uses student response, that teacher uses student response might not be me, the teacher, but the teacher that's sitting in, you know, the second row, third seat to the right or whatever. They may be the teacher at that moment.
Yeah, or maybe it's all the one student, right? I mean, if you get to the point where they're being really thoughtful and a little bit metacognitive about what they're doing, right, then they might say, okay, well, this is what I'm thinking and this is how I'm responding, then this might need to be my next step. And they're actually sort of eliciting that response on their own then.
Right, and it makes you think about the types of questions that you're asking. Like, does this just have a one right response? Because that stops this process, you know, and so what kind of questions am I asking that are going to encourage the students to ask more questions and to allow me to ask more questions based on their answer? So definitely more that could go into this. I agree with that though.
Yeah, that'll be what, 2 weeks? Is that what we get to do?
Yeah.
I'll talk to Maya, we'll see.
I had one more thing to add just to this conversation because it got my brain thinking a little bit too, but you know, as you go into observing students, especially during conversation, just thinking about what kind of conversation are they having. And Eric, what you were saying is what popped this into my head, because, you know, are we looking for kids to ask more questions? Are we looking for kids to draw connections, to be, you know, putting pieces together during the discussion? So just really thinking about what's the intention of the discussion that students are having can help us kind of frame our own questions, but also think about when are we ready to transition away from this discussion and into the next piece. So.
All right, so now let's look over at some of those responses, just how this changes the way we're gathering evidence in our classroom. Not good test takers, absolutely. Students see information can explain either by writing it or having conversations about it. Definitely, this is a huge thing that I saw, the confidence factor. That a student, you can have a conversation with them and you can kind of, you know, engage in that, or they are engaging with each other and you're chiming in and saying, wow, you really understand this. And I could tell by that. And they know that that counts for something, you know, and that's a good motivator to get them to talk as well. More equitable. Great. All right, almost to the end here.
So we were going to have you guys break out into breakout rooms, but with 10 people, I think we're just going to stay here. in just a moment, Jody's going to introduce the topic we're going to be using. But I want to take a moment as we talk about the informal learning that we've been talking about, the informal formative assessments. How does that fit into this greater scheme of all of these assessments that we have? And so a couple weeks ago, I introduced the idea of the Swiss cheese model, which we have there again. You know, you have the state assessments and they're great for what they do, but there's a lot of gaps in them. Things like, you know, they don't necessarily always attend to sense making, or they don't address everybody, you know, all the students in different levels, you know, equitably. So then you have your district assessments, which stack on top of that. Then you have your classroom assessments. And you have a chance to have that whole that goes all the way through, and you just don't ever realize this student can do what you think they can do. Or you never learn their strength. And so these informal discussions that we have is a great chance to attend to that equity, to break the mold of written assessments and actually have that conversation with students and, you know, cut through it. And so as we look forward at this task that Jody's going to talk to you about in a second, we can still have these informal discussions with students and try to fill those gaps that were may still exist. So Jody?
Okay, I gave you guys 2 links. Hopefully, yep, Anya's got them too. There's a couple questions that we kind of want to think about as we go through this. Should have turned on another computer.
I just wanted to
you-
make sure everybody was getting those links.
Yeah.
There, I can go to the question.
Oh, okay, so you've got the links up there as well. So we'll take a couple minutes to go through those 2 links, but some of the questions we want to discuss, you know, what do we know about the task? Is there only one way to use the task? Is there an opportunity for learning? Is this designed for all kids? How do we complete the learning? How does assessment support student learning? How are teachers learning through assessment? And what else would we need to make a good body of evidence? I always struggle with this, especially the part with equity, because I have one class that has got some very special kids, and right now it's very difficult for me to find tests or assessments or anything really that provides equity for all. Because like I said, when you have one little girl who is nonverbal and can't use her hands to even write, finding something that's equitable for her is a challenge. So we'll take a couple minutes and just kind of look through those 2 pieces.
And this again is expanding off of the TAPS that we used last time from Achieve, and their annotation key there at the top that has the different areas that we discussed as being something that we needed to think of while collecting a body of evidence. And if you haven't already, if you want to flip over to the task analysis piece. This is what they thought in relation to the pieces that they would need.
So Anya, we have 9 minutes left. Do you want to go ahead and start the discussion?
Sure. Do we just want to go to the next slide here? We're just really thinking about the questions on the last slide and what makes a complete body of evidence. So if we just want to unmute ourselves and kind of talk for the last 9 minutes here, addressing these questions. So what do we know about this task? We prefer to.
Well, I think the students are given a problem and they have to come up with a solution. Is that what you're meaning?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what we know is that they're, like I said, they've been given this scenario and this problem, and they have to come up with some type of solution for it.
And do we think that with this scenario task that there is a way that we can use some of the formal versus informal ways that we talked about today to gather evidence that they are understanding this task?
Yeah, I think you can. You can like give them the graphs and data and they can listen to them analyze it and see if they're actually understanding what the graphs are telling them. So, I mean, I think you can use it like that, or you can go around listening to their conversations, or going through, like if they're doing some type of drawing, like a plan, a blueprint or something before they actually get started, you know, I mean, you can go around and look at that too.
Mm-hmm. Right, definitely something we could collect at the end. They would have a product for a formal piece of evidence. But I would agree that there's multiple opportunities where we could listen to conversations of them analyzing the data.
Because if they're not analyzing the graphs properly and analyzing that data, then they're not going to get an accurate end product. So you want to address misconceptions there and make sure that you get that covered first before they move on.
Absolutely. Does anybody else have any ideas of the formal versus informal or anything about the task?
So I really liked that kids had some choice in this task. And that starts to speak a little bit more to the equity piece. But kind of also jumping off of what Nicole was talking about, was one of the comments from the reviewers was it maybe needs to not be so dependent on student knowledge of actual natural hazards. So, and I think, Nicole, this is kind of where you're going. If you had kids doing this as a group, then they could learn from each other about those specific natural hazards. You know, you can imagine different kids know things about earthquakes or tornadoes or, you know, anything they've experienced, and being able to share that to move their learning forward together, I think would make this not only more equitable, but would help to helpfully cross kind of in between those formal and informal opportunities to assess kids.
Yeah, I think that would definitely, seeing this as a group project, kind of getting that knowledge and being able to share experiences, like you said, Betsy. So definitely you can see that.
Well, and I think that talking about how the teachers learn through the assessment of this, listening to kids talk and seeing how big the scope is, as the reviewers talked about, it might turn this into a learning opportunity that's completely different than we were initially thinking. Maybe kids want to take it and do more research and go learn about some of the other examples, or do the natural disaster more closely related to where they live, as opposed to trying to clobber all of them together into one chart.
We kind of addressed equity a little bit here and the different opportunities for learning, but where could we maybe see some opportunities for completing student learning that might be unfinished from maybe, or maybe they don't have a lot of knowledge about the different natural hazards. So where is an opportunity for us to see if they still have the learning or get to where they need to be, even if they do have some gaps?
Well, I think if you're looking at like doing and interpreting data or analyzing data, I think you can look at like their end project to see if they actually analyze the data correctly, and then we're able to build around that. So I think you can look at that. I think you can look at different pieces of it and put it all together through that process there. So I think there's opportunity to do that. You might kind of have to be a little creative on how you're going to look for that completed learning, but I think it can be there. I think you can do some type of like in their writing, you can look even through their conversation. I still think you can look for completed learning.
Absolutely. That writing piece is also where I was thinking maybe we could even break down the written response a little bit, just to see where maybe their unfinished learning was. Was it really just because they didn't know about the natural hazard, or is it that, they don't understand what a human impact is? So like maybe we could break down those writing pieces.
Definitely. I mean, that can be, I think that would be a great idea, is to break it down into kind of scaffold and just break it down as they're going. So a little bit each time, instead of like one large written assignment, break it up a little bit for them. I think that'd be a good way to assess.
Right. All right. And then how are teachers learning through this assessment, and what else would we need as a teacher to feel like we knew that the students understood the information that we needed them to get?
Well, one of the things that I noticed when I looked at that, what do we need to have a good body of evidence? I definitely agree with the TAPS analysis, where they made mention that, sure, students would have to fully engage in the 3 dimensions. They would need to utilize the appropriate DCIs, those disciplinary core ideas. However, as it's kind of been pointed out before, there wasn't a lot of scaffolding the response to specifically ask students to express, where they are in their level of understanding and discovery on applying those appropriate DCIs in this assessment. So I think there needs to be more of those prompts for that dimensional piece.
Great. And if we look here, sometimes this might help. This is the actual standard that we're trying to get students to up here in the top right corner. So does this task, is it enough to be able to verify a student on this standard? Or would we need something more to really get specific evidence about this standard?
Well, on that document, it did point out that they'd say, hey, for a student to have a complete response, they need to have that DCI piece. However, they could potentially respond without using the DCI because it wasn't prompted in the question. At least I think that was my understanding of glancing through that document you have pulled up there.
I would
Or
agree
maybe
with
I'm not
you.
looking at it right. Let me know.
Nope. I would agree with you totally. Because we're definitely going to get a really good view of how they can analyze and interpret data, I think, with that informal observation like Nicole was speaking of. But really, this DCI, there is some opportunities where we might not be able to really get if they're getting that part, or if they're just doing a good job of analyzing the data that we've kind of put out there for them. So maybe what else could we use to collect? What would be the next step for you as a instructor to maybe finish developing that body of evidence so you felt like you knew if all students got there?
Well, for me, what just initially pops into my mind, and again, I'm high school and not, earth space science isn't my specialty. However, I think I might ask them something of saying, okay, so here is the raw data that we have. They can take it, they can interpret it, see those trends, and kind of look at those cross-cutting concepts and science engineering practices. But for the content piece, you might ask them, and so according to your understanding, why would these trends maybe be in place? Like understanding how different parts of either our climate or plate tectonics, those sort of things interact, like actually having that probing question for them, or diagramming it or modeling it.
I think the biggest thing when if we want to kind of wrap our brains through this whole entire thing, is when we tried to start assessing students, it's not going to be the traditional way we've assessed students in the past. You're not going to get, it's not a one assessment at the very end and either they know it or they don't. I think that the biggest thing is it's a process, and maybe one day you're really looking at assessing your CCC, and that's kind of where you're as you're walking through the classroom, you're kind of focused on that specific area to see where you're at with that, not forgetting the other two dimensions, but just like that's where you're at for that day. So it's messy. It's not, and I think that's probably where some teachers are frustrated, because we all really like the idea of being like, I'm going to teach this day. It's going to take 45 minutes. And at the end, they should know this. And we all now know that, like, when we're teaching three-dimensional, sometimes that does not happen. We have an objective, we have an idea of where we want the kids to go, but sometimes it takes 2 days for us to get to that point. Same with assessment. It's not one assessment is going to be able to assess everything.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, Jody. And I'm still trying to work with some of our district leaders to help them understand that too. So I'm glad. Yeah, I'm glad we're on the same page there.
And I agree too. It is a process, and I think that's what teachers and administrators are going to have to understand and allow us to be able to break into this somewhat new teaching style for a lot of us. And for some teachers, it's hard to give up some of that control. But we have to remember that it is a process, and we have to keep that end goal in mind of what the kids are going to learn, just making them better science students.
I mean, we value you guys' time. It's a little after 5. I think it's supposed to be done at 5. But I really appreciate you guys being on. This has definitely opened my eyes, and it has been super challenging, because when we were given this task of creating this, honestly and truthfully, was, I don't know, intense, to say the least. So I hope you guys have gotten something. I know I've learned a lot more than I had anticipated. But I think the biggest thing is we need to understand we are, everybody's in this together, and we're trying to help one another out. And so if you guys ever have questions, or if I have a question, I'll be calling you, emailing you, because this stuff is not easy, and it's not black and white. Oh, Nick, you gave me a little hand clap. Yay.
Yeah, I've got my camera off, so I better use those reactions.
Love that. So does anyone still have any questions, or is everybody ready for dinner and being outside? Because I can see Nicole and Tracy's, and it looks beautiful outside where you guys are. Anya, I can, like, you got a nice little glow behind you.
Yeah, it is nice weather. Very nice.
If not, I guess, if you have, is there something that they need to fill out at the end? Potentially.
Eric, if you have that link.
Eric's not on.
Oh, Eric got off. Okay, well, Colorado is taking, I'll email the people that are on with the form if he wants that out, but Colorado will take May 14th, and they're really looking at EL students and how to provide equitable assessments and how to evaluate those on May 14th. So come back for part 3 from Colorado. And have a great night.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Charlie's sitting on the chair. He's laying down on the chair.
And your kids. Ready?
Yeah, that's mine.
Charlie's laying down on the chair.
All right.
Hey, Anya,
Yes.
stay on for a sec, please.
You can stop recording too.
Yeah, I will. If I can
Yeah.
find the button.